the work here at Owens, I think, has, because of the kind of space that it is, that it's a square, high space, has made the exhibition really quite uh, contained. It it has a unification that, as each installation site is completely different, and so I had to consider the space itself as you're installing it, and it has to be about the space. It's also obviously about the work, but the space has to be integrated to the work. So I was very pleased that this space, in fact, other people have called it a very submersive space. There's a lot of light changing on the image all the time, and that kind of light, because the projection is 9 feet by 12, I think, or a bit bigger, it bathes all of the components in a kind of light, in a very faint light, which unifies them to me. It brings them all together, makes them all work together, even though the balloons, of course, although they're different sizes, different configurations, it unifies them even more as things that are integrated with each other throughout. So with this installation, as you walk in the door, for me what was wonderful is the 8-foot balloon, which hangs just kind of like an August moon does. It just hangs suspended like a moon. And I have to say I really like that idea, because it's a way to go into a space, to allow yourself a little bit of distance, to acclimatize yourself as a viewer into this environment. And also that there's sound slightly above, a few inches above you, because the balloon is suspended at 6 feet, just under 6 feet. So the sounds, the very low, bassy sounds that come down, you hear them, but you feel them on the body. And there's something, I think, that lets people kind of let go right there. There's a permission, I think, that I need for a viewer to have, to be completely comfortable in a space. Because I want people to feel as though they can open themselves up in this space, that they can trust that whatever will happen in this space it's a safe space. And even though there's tensions between that safeness and, the underwater shots of somebody who's struggling to breathe at times, but then coming back to this sound, these heartbeat sounds that are, even though we don't hear them in our bodies, are so reassuring to us, in fact, that we're alive. We never notice them. In fact, recently I saw a pulse on my wrist, and I was amazed to see this pulse, just see it, because I'd never seen my own pulse before. And to see that heartbeat there was quite amazing to me. So I think partially what I want people to do is to be able to feel the work, to allow themselves to be engaged in a very visceral and a very body-type centered way. I don't want this to be a work that it's not intended to be an intellectual piece of work. It's all about how your body feels, and trying to have the viewer remember what the experience of the body is. And it's something we all have. We all know when we have wounds, for instance, that if something's replicated, an experience, you see something, you fell off a bike, you had this wound. I have a wound on my knee and here from this bike experience that happened to me when I was like 15. I see a kid fall off a bike now and I'm recoiling. It's like, oh my God. And it's not that I intellectualize that, it's my body remembers it and remembers what that was. And so I'm prefacing the body. And that's why these sounds, as you go through the space of heartbeats that you can barely hear unless you're right next to them, but you feel them on the body, because the bass sounds come right down on the body. And so the body takes over. And it's a permission for you to allow your body to experience something versus, I know you see and you hear, but it's more about this. You need the other things to do it, but to experience something viscerally is what I'm really interested in this work. And so everything, all the components are geared to that. Yeah. Initially, when I thought about this work, which was a long time ago, just little bits of ideas, and they keep, as you investigate them, of course, they can become more and more complex and more layers to them. But I think for me, there were several themes that I was looking at. One was the idea of exposure of the body. And I mean, I'm a large, middle-aged woman, and our culture is not really crazy about that particular kind of woman. In fact, our culture gives permission to vilify women that way, and I think it's because of the maternal and this idea that when you're little, there becomes a time, especially with boys, but with girls too, where you can't hang on to mom anymore. Mom isn't your central figure anymore, and you're pulled away from that quite often. And it's kind of like, well, now you're a big boy, you can't cry, and you can't run to mom for everything. And so there's this almost this pushing away of the maternal in our culture, which I think also forms within, and I think within men, because it's pushed more than with women. This idea then turns into a kind of anger, I think, a very submerged kind of anger. And of course, then the maternal, which is the larger body of the mother, usually after you've had a baby, that's the way you are mostly, is vilified because people have been taught to put that away, to push that away. And I think there's something caught there, that rage at you can't have this anymore. You can't have this maternal figure that's always been so important to your existence. Obviously, when you're born, you have to have it, or you don't survive. And so to me, there's something, not only in the culture do we vilify that figure, because it's not the ideal, but for a lot of other reasons. But I think at the core of it is this idea of we can never go back to the maternal. And yet what happens in this work, I think, for me, I was not consciously, when I went underwater to do these experiments with how my body felt underwater, I was not really aware, not consciously aware, that I was, in fact, reenacting the maternal. I didn't really realize that. Of course, it was there, and everybody else could probably see it, but I never saw it, not consciously. I think I was dealing with it unconsciously. And so this idea of vilification of the female, middle-aged, fat body is something that we get to vilify in our culture. And so I was trying to explore that idea, and also about trying to come to terms with that very body myself. And so I wanted to be able to take a look at what my body might be like in a different environment. That weightlessness, formlessness, how would I move? How would I remember what it was like to be contained within my mother's womb? Would I be able to access that memory? Because that's the way I work. I have a really, really poor memory. And so it's always about trying to put some experience in my way so that hopefully it will trigger something and I'll come to some memory. Because I know they're not gone. They're all stored up there somewhere. It's just I have to access them. And how can I make these trigger points that will access them? And so that's what this whole project was really about. And to go right back to that very beginning, which for most of us is a very safe place, but not necessarily. And not always safe, because, of course, in my research I found out that the heartbeat of the mother, the fetus hate that term, but the unborn at a certain point, I mean, they're pretty engaged quite early on, is so dependent upon that heartbeat. As that heartbeat changes, that infant knows its whole being changes because, whatever, if the mother's under stress, if there's anything going on, change in the diet, something like that, that heartbeat tells that infant right away that there's something happening here. So think about that in terms of, the more research they're doing about this kind of stuff, to realize then how important the heartbeat is before you're even born. That it's a critical thing, and any changes to it affect you. So I think I was really quite interested in that whole idea of cognition before birth even, and what that's about. So that's one of the avenues I looked at. For instance, I've always been fascinated in my work with red, and also this idea of seeing inside and outside at the same time. So, as a kid, you would put your hands up to a bright lamp, and you'd see through your fingers. You could see right through them. Well, my research also taught me that, and this was amazing to me, that they know that an infant in the womb, if it's close to a really bright light, sees exactly that. So where do you think, I didn't come up with this. I didn't say, oh yeah, sure, I've heard that. That's what that is. No, I must have experienced it. So to me, that's just amazing that we can go back that far, even though for many reasons we don't remember those things, and there's lots of reasons. Probably the birth is the most important one why we don't remember, but those memories are actually there, and they form our consciousness before we're even born. So those kinds of ideas were really important for me in this work. A little further along. But obviously when I submerged myself in a dive tank, 12-foot deep dive tank, and blackened out all of the surfaces, the walls, the floor, and the surface of the tank in blackout cloths, and built one light in it, I'm really creating a kind of deprivation tank, or a space that I'm only in. And that's kind of like a womb-like space too. I'm not, like I say, I wasn't so very conscious about those things. They were intuitive things I needed to try out. But that's basically what I was doing, was trying to recreate a space to try to pull a memory from. And so that was really important to me. And so that inside-outside, I guess. There's quite a few layers to this work. I'm just trying to think. Issues of desire are really strong in my work. And so I try to use fabric as a kind of foil for the body. And our culture is all about that. What we cover the body is how we express our desire, because we're not close enough to the body. We're so removed from it that we can't express our body, most of us, unless we're dancers or whatever. But mostly we can't. And our culture doesn't allow for free expression of our bodies. So we use the clothing to express that. So for me, this clothing in water, this undulating fabric that's so sensuous and so much to me about desire, and in our culture, of course, that's so allowed, but, it's this peculiar idea about what desire is. It's the material in what we can't have, consumer-type material. But I was trying to look at how we really look at desire in the body that's not the perfect body, female body. And so part of what I wanted to do, and I'm not sure how successful this is in the work, to be honest, but I wanted to make the viewer, to feel their responsibility in the idea of the gaze, because this is also really important to me, is the kind of judgment a viewer makes is so incredible. I don't know that they really understand what kind of power that gaze has. And so my work, I try to play with that, disrupt it, try to think about what my gaze would be. But in this work, I'm playing with the idea of what the gaze, the male gaze, traditionally through film and, images for hundreds of years, what that does. And so I wanted to be able to take the idea of this woman who in past times, the voluptuous woman and fabrics and everything in paintings, go back to Rubens, etc., that was it. That was the idea of beauty. And then go to the other end so that first off you see the body and it's clothed in its undulating, beautiful fabric. And then as the video goes through, you see more and more of the body. At one point, the dress goes straight up and there you have it. You have the real body. But what amazed me was, because I thought that people would be revolted by that, here's the grotesque female. And here, I can judge because there's distance there, and that's what you need for judgment is distance. I'm fully in the frame. Right there you can judge. But what amazed me was people didn't go there. They went to the maternal because of all the other components, the balloons, the sounds of heartbeats above, those things. They just went to the maternal, which was unbelievable to me. But obviously, as artists, we never really know what it is we're doing. We think we do. I have all these things. I'm going to accomplish all these things as this work. And then something comes at you sideways that, because it's always about the unconscious, I think. So it was amazing to me to see that people's response was they wanted the maternal. That's what they wanted. Even though there's this danger there, there's somebody who's having a hard time breathing, etc., which no doubt the unborn infant will experience, for instance, if the mother is a smoker, for instance, or she's having respiratory problems, well, it's going to affect the unborn too, and immediately. So I think there's something that happens with the viewer that because it's not an intellectual project and a work, they allow the body to express itself, and it goes back to that memory, whether the viewer is actually cognizant at the moment of an actual memory doesn't matter. They obviously go there. So, which to me is just incredible. And I want people to make sure they stay in the space and feel comfortable enough in the space to experience that. That's most important for me. Well, in the large projection, of course, I use the video as just a reflection back of the way we take images of women, fashion shots, all those kinds of ways of looking at the female body in our culture, short of the pornographic, but that just those very quite traditional ways of looking. But then I also come really close and try to push that so that those images are right in your face. You cannot then judge. As soon as you close the distance on something, you've lost the way to judge something. So in that work, it was quite more traditional shooting, although, obviously from my point of view, but I was cognizant of using all of those particular ways of doing photography. That's coming out of photography, really, and film, I suppose, but mostly photography. And so when we finished editing this piece, which, of course, when you're doing something complex like that, that's got, many, many tracks of video on it and has, I had 12 hours of footage to choose from, in fact, even more than that, when we shot in a lake, but there's something that comes down and you kind of keep going to that, and part of, for me, what it was the beautiful imagery, the stuff that was the high contrast, really beautiful black and white, the seductive. So that sort of narrowed what I chose for footage. And as soon as we finished editing that work, the very next day I said, okay, now I need to expose me because I didn't feel that I had. And yet all the way through that whole shoot, it was so much about exposure that it was very difficult for me to just be there, to be honest. It was very hard. I know nobody can see that really now, but I know it. And so as soon as that piece was finished, the very next day I just went back in the footage and I just went to that footage. It just kept calling to me somehow. And so it's really not edited. It's just a number of clips. And it's when I first went in the water and I was trying to get used to the water. So there was no fear there at that point. I was just exploring the water and obviously in a different space in my mind than just water. And so I guess really what I wanted to show, I realized after I picked that footage and put it together and thought, okay, this will do, is vulnerability. And I think that's what I want from the viewer. I want the viewer to realize their judgment makes us so vulnerable. So that was important for me. And for people to recognize that vulnerability that's in all of us, but that judgment, it just flattens people. It completely annihilates them. And people, I just wanted people to be able to see that. Now, whether that comes through or not, I'm not sure. But it was one of the things that was really important to me in the work. And I suppose it's accomplished that somewhat because of people not going to the grotesque female with a fat belly and fat body. They go to the maternal. So there must be something that happens there, I guess. I don't know. Being a large woman and being quite large for all of my adult life, and knowing that our culture, doesn't condone the larger female body, I always felt trepidation at just existing in the world in a way. So I never felt I could take up space. I always had to be careful of my voice, and part of this is my upbringing too. But I'm of an age too where, my father was a photographer, took my picture, and he was a professional photographer. So you smile for the camera, you look good for the camera. It's all about the gaze. It's all about how you look. And people judge you based on how you look. I mean, nothing's changed really. And so for me, being in that spotlight when I was young, when my father took my picture, was wonderful. So of course I grew up with this strange idea that you had to look really good in order to be actually noticed. And so there's a lot of, complex things around that very subject. But then of course when I wasn't the ideal figure anymore, then I kind of turned inwards and I just didn't feel that I had permission to be. And so it was difficult. And I think right off with my first solo exhibition, making a size 66 strapless evening gown, was about creating space to stand in, to be in, to exist in for me. And it was funny with that work because as soon as that dress went up, it's 15 feet high, I don't know how many meters that is, and 9 feet across, and you stand right underneath it in the first site-specific installation it was in. And it was funny, I thought, oh, here it is. Okay, now I have this permission to take up space, to actually physically take up space. I'm quite didactic that way. And it was funny, about a month later, I kept having this really constricted throat. I'd never had this in my life. My throat kept getting constricted every day. And I didn't understand what it was like, what it was about. And I thought, this is odd. I know there's nothing physically wrong. I'd gone to the doctor. No, there's nothing wrong. And then, so one day I went into the sound room at NASCAD. I just sat in the sound room and I just took a microphone. There was a fan. It was hot summer. Turned the fan on and pushed the microphone into the fan and got this screeching sound, feedback. It was wonderful. And it was, so I played and played and played with speaking. I never uttered a word. I just used industrial things, sounds, and I manipulated them until, you know, when you get a feedback sound, it's like a scream. It's like this control thing comes in and out. But to me, it was a scream, which I have great difficulty screaming, which is a whole other thing. But it's part of that, you know, being able to express yourself in a big way, you know, like, and so once I did this work, and it wasn't even for that piece particularly, it was for another piece, the sore throat, you know, the constricted throat went away completely. And it took me months and months, as it always does when you make work, sometimes years and years, before you realize what that was. I needed voice as well as space, and that's what that gave me, that playing with industrial sounds was about that. Yeah, so yeah, I learned something really very interesting about that I have to trust my unconscious, because that's where the wealth of everything is. My conscious self is about that deep, and everything else is contained within, and that's where, you know, you want to plumb those depths, for me anyway. And of course, fear is something we all have. It's, you know, fear and anger are those two baddies, so we think. Well, fear, not so much a bad emotion, but it governs us because it's about how we exist. You know, without fear, we would not exist. We wouldn't be able to survive. So it's a very basic instinct, and it helps us survive. I just wanted to open up, I always do want to open up what it is I'm afraid of, because then I can exist in the world in an even better way. And I don't need to be governed by those fears that usually start when we're very young children. And if something doesn't happen to alleviate them, they just kind of hang on and grow over the years until they change into something we're not even sure of. But they're big, you know, and so I want to open them up and explore what they are. And my way of doing that is to try, again, because I have such poor memory, is to try to create a situation that will trigger something. Then I can take a look at that and say, oh, now I understand why I am the way I am. But also what that does is it gives you, you know, the self-esteem. But it does. It says, okay, those were my strategies. That's how I survived. Now I can see what that's all about, you know, and it's like a forgiveness of the self, in a way, to me, somewhat. I mean, I just need to find these things out so that, and that other people can see that it's not just me, it's not just about me. I get to use myself as a subject because I'm the only one who will, you know, I can't ask you to delve into things. I can't possibly know what those things are, even if you tell me. It won't make any difference because it's what's really right in here and way down in your unconscious. So I can only use myself as the subject to explore those things. And then what I want to do then is communicate to other people that, okay, this is what this experience was, but it's really a universal experience. It's just that mine is slightly personalized, but hopefully people will realize that we're all in the same boat, you know, and that this is a way to, that I've looked at it, and maybe you could look at it, and maybe you might get something from that too, as I did. Yeah. I've been a furtive performance artist, I think, and being someone who works with video and uses the self as subject, you're always a performance artist, but it's in a very controlled way. And, well, I think it is, but actually it isn't. It's those things we tell ourselves to make ourselves think it's fine. You know, it's safe and everything else, but it's still about exposure. But so I was very excited to be part of the performance symposium because I knew I wanted to do some performance, and this gave me the structure to do it. So, you know, so I guess as the work in Breathing Underwater is about trying to reach inside ourselves to have some better understanding of ourselves, I think. So did the performance. That, to me, the performance was about trying to create an intimate moment between strangers. And and I think that's very difficult. And in our culture, we don't touch, like the boundaries of our bodies are pretty strict with people that we don't know intimately. And it's such a loss because we're so isolated. And it seemed to me, when I did a workshop, in fact, I did a workshop here some years ago, and that's what I explored, this idea of intimacy, touch of the body. And I'm interested in not only how a person receives that intimate touch, but how the person who's administering it feels as well. So it's this back and forth between the two. And what we did was, for the performance, I had these aprons designed that had all kinds of pockets in them, and we had all kinds of different bandages. Some real bandages, but some that were pseudo bandages. So they were beautiful colors, red organza, or there was this white fabric that was quite lovely, and then there was elastoplast strips that had thick, 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 deep red velvet on. So this idea, if you put it on the body and you touch the body, and you're aware of the body and the idea of touch. So I was very interested in how we could create an intimate moment with somebody that's just a moment, but resonates, You always, those things in life, you always want something that resonates, because it always leads on to something else, something else, something else within ourselves, right? It just needs an external trigger to start us off on some kind of personal journey of some kind, no matter how, tentative or how far that goes, just to be able to think about things in a way that has the idea of touch to it and intimacy. So for me, it's about a kind of healing, that we all have these scars. They can be physical, they can be real, they can be psychological, but we all have scarring. That's what life's about. And to realize, I think, that we all need to be able to acknowledge that, and that we do have needs. And the physical touch is something that is so profound to us, but that we really don't. We run away from it in our culture. It's something we just don't want anything to do with. So this was really about trying to just see what just a slight touch on somebody, whether that's a idea of healing, of some kind of healing. And as soon as you start to explore things, of course, that hurt us, that is the process of healing itself. So I guess it sounds pretty didactic, but that's kind of what I was wanting to do.